Let's look at these two sentences. She played well, but the fielder catched the ball. She prepared for her exam and teached her friends as well. You can notice there is a mistake in both sentences. You may know we cannot use catched as the past form of catch, and we cannot use teached as the past form of teach. The correct forms are taught and caught. But if you look at play and prepared, we can use played and prepared. We simply have ed at the end. Why is this a difference? Why can't we have catched and teached when we can have prepared and played? We get confused and make this mistake every day. That's what we are going to learn today. But before we look at this difference, let's try and understand some basics first. Verbs can be divided into three major categories. The first category is main verbs. These are also called full verbs or lexical verbs. For example, eat, live, study, run, go. So these are called main verbs. The second category is primary verbs. We have be, have, do forms of verbs here. For example, am, is, or, was, were, has, have, had, do, does, did. So these are called primary verbs because these have two functions. They are used as auxiliary verbs as well as main verbs. An auxiliary verb is a helping verb. It is always used with another main verb. Take these examples. I'm playing hockey. I have done my work. If you look at these two sentences, we have am and have used as auxiliary verbs because they are used with other main verbs. I'm a teacher. If you look at this sentence, we have am here. It is not used with any other verb. So here it acts as a main verb. So you can see primary verbs have two functions. They act as main verbs as well as auxiliary verbs. So this is the second category. The third category is modal auxiliary verbs. The words such as can, could, may, might, should are called modal auxiliary verbs. And these can only be used along with main verbs, always. They can never be used alone. So we've got three categories. One, main verbs. Second, primary verbs that act as auxiliary verbs as well as main verbs. Third, modal auxiliary verbs. So in these three categories, only the main verbs and primary verbs have the capacity to change themselves so that they can add more information to a verb, such as tense and voice. This is the focus of today's discussion. We are going to discuss how these verbs change today. We will later discuss why they change and where we use them in detail. Verbs generally have four forms. First, base or present form. Second, past form. Third, past participle. Fourth, present participle. We can call them V1, base form, V2, past form, V3, past participle, V1 ing. So adding ing to the base form, present participle. So you can take any main verb in English, that verb will have these forms. For example, look at these verbs. Take play. Past form is going to be played. And past participle, played. And present participle, playing. Enjoy, enjoyed, enjoyed, enjoying. Watch, watched, watched, watching. Live, lived, lived, living. Study, studied, studied, studying. When you observe how these verbs change here, you can see a pattern. We simply add d or ed at the end when we write them in past and past participle. So the verbs that take d or ed at the end have the same past and past participle forms. And these are called regular verbs. Now we've got the second category, look at the past and past participle forms of these verbs. Go, went, gone, going. We don't have D or ED at the end. Write, wrote, written, writing. Drink, drank, drunk, drinking. Build, built, built, building. Cut, 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 cutting. So you can see here, there is no specific pattern. And these verbs are called irregular verbs. To quickly summarize, all the main verbs have 4 forms. V1, V2, V3, V1 ing. And these verbs can be divided into 2 major categories: regular verbs and irregular verbs. The verbs that have ed at the end are called regular verbs. In other words, when you use a regular verb in the past, you can simply have d or ed at the end. You do not need to worry about anything else. The verbs that do not follow this pattern are called irregular verbs. So when you use an irregular verb in the past, you should be very careful not to make the mistake of adding ed. This leads to our main question. How do we know whether a verb is a regular verb or an irregular verb? If you know a verb is a regular verb, we can simply have ed at the end. There is no need to worry about anything else. Likewise, if you know a verb is an irregular verb, we know it has got its own past and past participle forms. To address this question, we need to go back to the history of English a bit. In those days, they seemed to have 2 ways to write the past form of a verb. The first was adding ed at the end, that we are very familiar with. The second was changing the vowel sound. For example, write, wrote, written. Drink, drank, drunk. Rise, rose, risen. Of course, you cannot apply this changing vowel rule to all the irregular verbs. Some don't follow any rule. However, as the years passed, people became more accustomed to the first way of writing the past form of a verb, that is, adding ed. It became very popular. People started using ed at the end in the past and past participle forms. Slowly, the second method died out. People stopped using it. Then you may ask this question: why do we then have a list of irregular verbs now? The answer is very simple. Some verbs did not take ed at the end because they were the most commonly used verbs in everyday life. So they resisted this change of taking ed at the end. Thus, we ended up with a list of irregular verbs. Who knows? After a few centuries, we may not even have these irregular verbs at all, as we already have people using regular forms for a few irregular verbs in some parts of the world. For example, we have people using both learnt, learned, dreamt, dreamed, spilt, spilled, spoilt, spoiled. Now the point here is, the irregular verbs do not follow any specific rule, and they are from Old English. Fortunately, it is a very small list. There are only around 250 irregular verbs in English, according to this famous grammar book, and we should memorize them. There is no other way around. But once you learn these irregular verbs, that's it. You can consider all the other verbs in English to be regular, and you can simply have ed at the end. And it is not difficult to memorize them either, because there are many verbs with only prefixes changing. For example, look at this verb, take. The first form is took, and the past participle form is taken. Now look at these verbs, undertake, overtake, mistake. We've just added different prefixes, and you do not need to memorize these verbs again, because they have the same changes. Take. Take, took, taken. Undertake, undertook, undertaken. Overtake, overtook, overtaken. Mistake, mistook, mistaken. As I've said already, this list is from Old English, and it is not going to change as long as English lives. By not changing, I mean there won't be any new verbs added to the list. All the new verbs that are coined or borrowed will take the first way of using ed at the end. That means they are added to the regular category. Look at these real-time examples. We have Google. When we use it in the past, we go with Googled. Tweet, tweeted. Elon Musk has changed Twitter to X now. I don't know whether we would use Xed, but retweeted has changed to reposted. Now you know why we have irregular verbs and what you need to do with them. If you start today, you learn all the irregular verbs in English in less than a week's time, as you may already know many of them. Once you learn the irregular verbs, you will never make the mistake of adding ed again. And you will never have any doubt throughout your life. That's it for today. I'll meet you in the next one. Happy learning.